Every year, millions of people start their gardens with hope, believing that this season will finally make them more self-reliant. But by the end of the year, they are right back where they started. Buying seeds again, spending money again, preparing the same soil again, and depending on the same grocery stores they wanted to escape in the first place, while food prices continue to rise faster than most families can keep up, turning what should be a simple act of feeding yourself into an endless cycle of spending and repeating. And even those who try to grow their own food often feel stuck, because annual gardening demands constant attention yet never creates anything lasting. So the effort disappears with the first frost and the entire process resets, leaving people tired, discouraged, and still dependent on systems they cannot control, which means the garden becomes another temporary task instead of a solution, another expense instead of an investment, and another reminder that working harder is not the same as building something that actually endures. What almost no one notices is the quiet loss happening beneath this yearly routine, because each season you are not just planting again, you are paying again for soil amendments, fertilizers, replacement plants, extra water, and tools that promise better results but rarely change the outcome. And when those costs are added over 5 or 10 years, they become a serious amount of money spent just to repeat the same temporary harvests, while your time follows the same pattern, weekends filled with digging, replanting, and fixing problems that should not exist in a stable growing system. Yet none of that effort carries forward into the next year, and even the soil is forced into a cycle of disturbance that prevents it from developing the deep structure and natural fertility that only come with continuity. So instead of building strength, the garden is constantly being reset. And this is the difference between a reset mindset and a system mindset, because a reset consumes resources to recreate what you already had, while a true system is designed so that every season adds to the last one, slowly turning work into lasting production rather than repeating labor that never compounds. The real transformation begins when you stop thinking about gardening as something you must restart every year and start thinking about it as something that should continue without you, because in the natural world, plants are not designed to live for a single season and disappear. They are designed to return, to deepen their roots, to store energy underground, and to grow back stronger when conditions allow. And these are called perennials, plants that do not need to be replanted because they establish themselves once and then produce again and again, quietly doing the work on their own. And when you shift to growing this kind of food, you are no longer chasing each season with new effort. You are building living systems that remember where they are planted and resume growth automatically, which means the question changes from how much can I grow this year to how much can this space produce for the next 20 years. And this is where plant once, harvest for years, becomes a practical strategy instead of a hopeful idea, because you are creating something that improves with time rather than something that disappears at the end of every season. This system works because it follows the same pattern that natural landscapes have used for thousands of years, where plants survive not by being constantly replaced but by establishing deep, permanent root systems that reach far below the surface to find water, minerals, and stability that shallow annual crops can never access. And once those roots are in place, the plant no longer depends on frequent watering, heavy fertilizing, or constant care. It begins to regulate itself, drawing what it needs from the soil while also improving that soil through fallen leaves, natural mulching, and biological activity that builds fertility over time instead of depleting it. And this is the part that changes everything, because instead of a garden that demands input to survive, you begin to create one that produces its own support system, where each season adds strength rather than stress, making the plants tougher against drought, temperature swings, and neglect. So the space starts behaving less like a fragile project and more like a quiet machine that runs in the background, requiring less effort each year while delivering more reliable harvests. Almost nobody talks about this shift because it does not look dramatic, but it is exactly what turns gardening from work into production. The success of this system is decided before the first plant even goes into the ground, because when you are planting something meant to live for 15 or 20 years, you cannot treat placement as temporary. You must begin thinking like a builder rather than a seasonal gardener, choosing locations that receive consistent sunlight, have good drainage, and allow plants enough room to mature fully instead of crowding them the way people often do with annual crops, because spacing that feels wide in the first year becomes exactly right by the third and critical by the fifth. And here is where most people get it wrong. They design for how the garden looks today instead of how it will function years from now. But perennials expand, roots spread, and the system needs that breathing space to remain low maintenance, so you walk the area slowly, imagine pathways that allow access without disturbing soil, place long, living plants where they will not need to be moved, and create a layout that can remain untouched as it matures. And by doing this, you are not just planting food, you are establishing infrastructure, something stable and predictable that will support harvests long after the initial work is forgotten, which is why this foundation stage quietly determines whether the system becomes effortless abundance or ongoing correction. Once the foundation is set, the focus shifts to choosing plants that are not grown for novelty but for dependable production, the kind of perennial crops that return real food year after year without demanding to be replanted. And this is where the mindset must stay practical, because the goal is not to grow rare or decorative varieties, but to establish sources of calories, vitamins, and steady harvests that can actually feed a household, plants that wake up each season already rooted, already adapted, already prepared to grow, which means less time nurturing seedlings and more time collecting food that is ready to use. And almost nobody talks about this difference, because modern gardening culture often celebrates variety over reliability. But a self-sustaining system depends on crops that are resilient, repeatable, and capable of producing large amounts over long periods. So you begin to see the garden less as a place for experimentation and more as a living pantry that refills itself, where each plant is selected because it contributes something essential, whether that is consistent greens, dense energy, or long harvest windows. And as these plants mature, they begin to overlap their seasons, providing food in waves instead of single bursts, which quietly transforms the space into a production system rather than a hobby space, delivering nourishment with less input and greater predictability each passing year. This is the stage where patience matters more than effort, because the first year is not about harvesting as much as possible. It is about allowing the plants to establish the deep roots that will support them for decades. And here is where most people get it wrong. They treat perennials like annual crops, constantly adjusting, watering too often, adding unnecessary fertilizer, or disturbing the soil when growth seems slow. But what looks like inactivity above ground is actually intense development below the surface, roots pushing deeper, building networks, anchoring the plant so it can survive heat, cold, and dry periods without help. And if you interfere too much during this phase, you weaken the very system you are trying to build. So the logic of the first year is simple: prepare well, plant carefully, provide basic support, and then step back, letting natural processes do their work, because this early restraint creates long-term strength, reducing future maintenance, lowering water needs, and allowing the garden to become increasingly independent. And by the end of that first cycle, you may not yet see dramatic harvests, but you have created something far more valuable, a foundation that will begin producing with less and less involvement from you as time goes on. By the second year, this is where the change becomes visible, and a simple example shows how quickly the system begins to return what was invested. Because imagine a small backyard that was planted with long, living food crops during one careful season. The first year required some preparation and occasional watering. But by the second spring, the plants returned on their own without replanting. Growth started earlier than any annual garden could be planted, and the harvest window stretched longer with very little effort. And by the third year, production increased enough that regular trips to buy certain vegetables were no longer necessary, cutting grocery spending by a noticeable amount each month, sometimes saving $50 to $100 depending on the size of the planting. while the time spent maintaining the space actually dropped because there were no seedlings to manage and no beds to reset, and this is the part that changes everything. The garden begins to behave like an investment instead of an expense. By years 4 and 5, yields stabilize into predictable cycles. Plants become tougher, watering becomes less frequent, and harvesting replaces labor as the main activity. So instead of rebuilding the garden each season, you simply walk through it and collect what has already grown, which is when people realize they are no longer trying to make a garden work, they are operating something that now works on its own and continues to reduce both effort and dependence as it matures. As the years continue, the system begins to require even less attention because the plants are no longer trying to establish themselves. They are fully rooted, fully adapted to the space, and working in rhythm with the seasons rather than against them, so maintenance shifts from constant intervention to occasional observation. Fallen leaves and plant residue naturally cover the soil, forming a protective layer that holds moisture, reduces weeds, and feeds the microorganisms below, which means the soil quietly becomes richer without needing repeated inputs, and almost nobody talks about this slow improvement because it happens gradually, but it is exactly what allows watering to decrease, fertilizing to become unnecessary, and seasonal changes to feel less disruptive. In spring, the plants return early using energy stored underground. In summer, their deeper roots help them handle heat without stress. In autumn, they continue producing while also preparing themselves for dormancy, and in winter they rest without needing to be removed or replaced. So instead of fighting each season, you begin to work alongside it. And this is where the garden stops feeling like a task and starts behaving like a self-sustaining environment that supports itself, needing only light guidance while continuing to produce food reliably year after year. Over time, the value of this system goes far beyond the food it produces, because what you have really created is stability in a world that often feels uncertain, a space that continues to provide regardless of price changes, supply disruptions, or outside conditions, and that quiet reliability changes how you think about provision. You are no longer reacting to shortages or rising costs. You already have something growing that answers those needs without asking permission. The long-term savings accumulate almost unnoticed as fewer purchases are required season after season. But more important than the money is the shift in identity that takes place. You stop seeing yourself as someone trying to maintain a garden and begin to recognize that you are managing a productive system. Something designed to endure, something that improves with age rather than wearing out. And this is the part that almost nobody measures, the sense of control that comes from knowing your effort years ago is still working for you now, the confidence that comes from harvests that return without starting over, and the understanding that self-reliance is not built through constant labor but through thoughtful decisions that create lasting structure. So in the end, this is not just about planting crops, it is about choosing permanence over repetition, building something that continues quietly in the background, and stepping away from dependency into a form of independence that grows stronger with every passing season.